Hey guys, tonight we open a coffin. Not just any coffin, though one that hasn't seen daylight in centuries. It sits beneath layers of stone and royal ceremony, buried deep inside Westminster Abbey. You smell it before you see it. An invisible, cloud metallic, damp, sickly sweet curls up from ancient hinges. You're not supposed to be here, and your nose is already regretting it. This isn't just a tomb. It's a time capsule wrapped in velvet and rot. A box that once held England's most mythologized monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Fairy Queen, the woman who stared down the Spanish Armada and allegedly died untouched, undefeated, and completely alone. But what if she didn't stay alone? You're going to wish this was a ghost story, because ghosts don't stink. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to see how far this little crypt is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stairwell is narrow, spiraling downward, like intestines. Your flashlight flickers once, dramatically. Fitting. The Abbey isn't quiet. It creaks, breathes, shifts. No one built this place to hold silence. And that scent again, thicker now, like mildew trapped inside a tin box. You reach the final step and stop. There it is. A stone slab with one name chiseled above. Elizabeth. No, the first. No dates. Just Elizabeth. You run your hand over the damp lettering, the limestone sweating slightly beneath your touch. It's been here since 1603, give or take some Victorian tampering. You remember the blueprint. The coffin lies just beneath this floor, sealed inside a stone vault, along with her half-sister Mary. Yes, that Mary, the one she imprisoned and erased from public memory. And now, in death, they're roommates. The floor's been lifted before. You can tell. The concrete is patchy, uneven. There's a bite of newer mortars at the edges. Someone opened this not once, but maybe twice. The most public time, 1869, during renovations. The workers claimed to find both coffins stacked, Mary on the bottom. But no one talks about what it smelled like, what leaked out, what shouldn't have been there. But you're not in 1869. You're here, and you're lifting the lid. It's not easy. The air rushes out first, like the vault's been holding its breath for centuries. And with it comes that smell, loily, meaty, wrong, not just decay, more chemical, like someone tried to stop the rot but failed halfway through. That's the royal way, isn't it? Appear perfect, even while decomposing. You lean down. The coffin is light-blind. Smart. It was meant to preserve. Lead coffins slow decomposition by locking out moisture and oxygen. But sometimes, they do the opposite. They trap gases, build pressure, make the body stew in its own juices. Elizabeth might have been marinating for over 400 years. And now you've popped the lid. Inside, it's dark. Your light bounces off the inside of the coffin, a dull glint of something once regal. Fragments of silk, a strip of lace, and then something stranger, a jawbone, half-yellowed, clenched tightly shut. The teeth are still sharp, real, human, probably. Hers. She was famous for her teeth. You remember? Not in a good way. Toward the end, Elizabeth's smile was more myth than mouth. Contemporary accounts say she had blackened, rotting teeth, possibly from sugar, which was a Tudor luxury, or from stress, or syphilis. Historians still argue whether she ever smiled in her final decade. Some claim she kept her mouth covered with a handkerchief or used paste to mask the rot. You wonder if those teeth clenched in front of you ever hurt her in life. They look painful, even now. And they're nestled beside the mandibles something shinier, a ring, deep green stone, possibly an emerald. The famous espial ring. Elizabeth wore it always, some say even to bed. It opened to reveal miniature portraits herself and her mother, Anne Boleyn, the mother who died by Henry VIII's axe. Symbolic, huh? Mother and daughter, both headstrong, both legends, both buried under stone. But you're not sure this ring is real. Could be a replica, could be a plant. The 1774 exhumation alleged, of course, mentioned a missing ring. So did the Victorians, so why is it here now? You step back. It's not just bones and baubles. There's something viscous pooled beneath the rib cage. Dark, tar-like. Could be decomposition fluids. Could be embalming residue. Could please, no lead, leech 8. Lead is poisonous, you know. Slow and sneaky. And Elizabeth's body was sealed in it for centuries. The irony isn't lost on you. The coffin meant to preserve might have been the thing that ensured she stank for eternity, and stank she does. You can't stop coughing. Your eyes water. You fumble the flashlight. It lands with a soft thud on a velvet-trapped lump. Was that her hair? Some strands are still attached to the scalp. Pale, reddish-brown, almost strawberry blonde. Not quite the blazing red we associate with her portraits. But then again, she wore wigs. Piles of them. Her natural hair likely. Faded with age, with stress, with sickness. And here it is. Fragile, papery, almost weightless. You want to say something respectful, but your throat burns. The stink is unreal. Medieval sources sometimes described royal bodies as sweet after death, like the divine fragrance of sainthood. No one's calling this smell holy, and that's, when you see it, the inside of the coffin is bulging slightly, pressed against the lead lining, as though something inside expanded over time. Could be the gases, could be swelling, could be bad design. Lead-lined coffins are known to balloon when decomposition gases build up. In fact, in some cases, usually Victorian. Because of course coffins have even exploded under pressure. Now imagine that happening here, in the Abbey, on a busy Sunday. You look up, the vaulted ceiling is so far away, it feels like sky. Somewhere, above tourists walk, shuffle, whisper. They have no idea what lies beneath them, or what might still be rotting. You close the lid, or try to. It doesn't sit right. Something's changed. Maybe you, Elizabeth's coffin is back in its box, but not before it leaked secret sand fluids into the present. You start back up the stairs. The smell clings to your clothes, your hair, your tongue, and behind you, sealed again, the coffin waits, still warm. You don't dream on the first night after opening a coffin like that. Not really. You hallucinate gently, somewhere between nightmare and nausea, and when you wake up piff, you ever do you're still inside the story. So, you go back. Not physically. Mentally, you retrace your steps to the final days of the Virgin Queen, when her breath still fogged up the palace windows and her enemies were counting the minutes. It's March, 1603. England is damp and anxious. The Queen is dying. She doesn't admit it, of course. Elizabeth never really admitted weakness, not in war, and certainly not in bed. But her body is unraveling faster than her image can hold. She hasn't eaten in days. She won't sleep. She stands for hours, silent and trembling, refusing pillows or help. Her ladies-in-waiting beg her to lie down. She refuses. It's like she's afraid to stop moving as if rest means surrender. Her crown may be safe, but her soul feels hunted. You watch from the shadows of Richmond Palace, tucked between tapestries, and the mood is brittle. Everyone is whispering. Courtiers trade rumors like currency. One day she's better, the next she's near death. Physicians pace outside her chamber like anxious dogs. Some have already left, deciding their presence is either futile or politically inconvenient. You inch closer. Inside the chamber, candles burn at all hours. The air is thick with smoke, perfume, and the unmistakable musk of sweat and old wool. The Queen sits in her chair, hunched, draped in black, her once golden wig slightly crooked. Her cheeks are gaunt. The famous white paint cirrus, made with light, is cracked along her jawline. Her hands tremble slightly as she holds a handkerchief. She dabs her mouth, then folds the cloth quickly. You see the faintest trace of blood. That blood isn't from her teeth this time, it's her lungs. Elizabeth may have been suffering from pneumonia, or bronchitis, or something worse. Historians still argue whether her final illness was a natural decline, slow and expected, or the result of something more abrupt, an infection, a hidden tumor, a stroke. There were no autopsies, no post-mortems. Just guesses and silence. And here's the thing no one says out loud: they're scared of her. Even now, especially now, because Elizabeth has ruled for 44 years, longer than many of her advisors have been alive. She's outlived lovers, threats, plots, and plagues. She's more symbol than human. The idea that she could die like anyone else, it feels unnatural. She doesn't name a successor. Not exactly. She gestures, vaguely, toward James VI of Scotland's, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the very cousin she had executed. Talk about poetic or toxic. Take your pick. The transition of power hangs like a fog, thick, weighty, and dangerous. You hear it before you see it, the rattle in her throat, that gurgling rasp they called the death rattle. Her attendants say she's stopped speaking. She hasn't moved in hours. Her hand falls limp. The Queen is still, but no one announces her death. Not right away. There's protocol, timing. Eventually, someone whispers the words, "The Queen is dead." Just like that, the Elizabethan era ends. Or does it? Because in the days that follow, things get weird. For one, her body doesn't cool the way it should. Some accounts note that her chamber remained unusually warm, that no one wanted to touch her for too long. Her servants avoid her bed. Her wigs are removed carefully, perhaps too carefully, and the makeup, it's flaking off in chunks, revealing lesions no one wants to talk about. They start the embalming immediately. Well, sort of. See, embalming in 1603 isn't what it is today. There are no refrigerated morgues, no surgical-grade instruments, just herbs, cloth, and if you're lucky, a few jars of resin and spiced wine. For royalty, they used stronger concoctions, oils, salts, sometimes even lead powders. Elizabeth's team begins wrapping her body in layers of linen soaked in preservatives, but they do it fast. Too fast. Why? Well, it's a bit delicate. Her body was beginning to leak. Sources suggest she was already bloated, swelling, and that the smell again was becoming noticeable. Even among the incense burners, even in the palace. And here's where things get speculative. Some fringe historians believe her body was deteriorating so quickly that the embalmers had to improvise. One theory posits that they inserted a rolled lead sheet into the abdomen, sort of like a plug to keep everything from slipping out. Another claims they lined her coffin with powdered lime to dry out the fluids. Neither method worked completely. They dressed her, eventually, in state robes, velvet, fur, and lace. Her crown placed gently on the pillow above her head, her face painted one final time, but they kept the chamber sealed. Even for a queen, there were limits. The effigy was carried out first, not her real body. A wax likeness, seated upright on a wooden platform, dressed in full regalia. This wasn't just for ceremony, it was damage control. The actual corpse was too unstable, so they sent out a mannequin to wave goodbye. The people never saw her real face again, only wax. You step back from the memory, chilled. You can smell it again, faintly. That funeral rot mixed with lavender and lead. The Queen's last breath wasn't sweet. It was a chemical cocktail of desperate preservation, and beneath all the silken protocol, there was panic. One footnote: before you go, the coffin wasn't placed immediately in its final resting place. For a while, It was held in a temporary vault within the abbey. Some say it stayed there for weeks. Others whisper months. Why? Construction delays, political nerves, or maybe something else. Maybe they weren't ready to bury her. Maybe they were waiting for the smell to fade. You return to the coffin, but this time you don't descend alone. You're dragging centuries of propaganda behind you, trailing silks and coronation speeches like chains. Because if you want to understand Elizabeth's legacy, you can't just stare at her bones. You have to look at what they buried her in, and what they buried with. Let's start with the silk. Her funeral garments were extravagant, of course. Royal burial outfits were rarely simple, and Elizabeth's were a patchwork of symbolism and silent messaging. You picture it. Layers upon layers of black velvet, trimmed with ermine fur. The same color worn by mourners, widows, and judges. The same fur used to line coronation robes. Everything chosen had meaning. Everything told a story, even the fabric silk, imported from Italy or the Ottoman Empire, often made up the inner lining of noble shrouds, and Elizabeth's wardrobe, even in death, was no exception. The Tudors loved their imported silks, their damasks, their shimmering brocades. She likely lay swaddled in the finest woven threads money could buy. Some died with cochineal beetles for that rich crimson sheen. Expensive, foreign, royal, but the irony. That fabric outlived her flesh. In one of the few surviving burial vaults, inspections a quiet one. No cameras, no pressament, noted the silks were moist, not rotted, not shredded, just damp, clinging, still faintly perfumed. It's possible, even likely, that the chemical compounds used in 16th century dyeing processes gave the fabric some unintentional preservative properties, like she was, swaddled in antimicrobial luxury. And then there were the secrets. You lean closer. Inside the folds of cloth, beneath the formal shrouds, historians believe there were personal items tucked quietly away. A miniature book of psalms, perhaps a ring or two, but most famously, possibly, a lock of hair. Not hers, her mother's, Anne Boleyn's. Here's the fringe theory. Some say Elizabeth carried her mother's hair wrapped in a ribbon and kept it in her private chambers until her death. It was said to be hidden in a compartment of her famous locket ring. Others argue it was interred with her, placed there by her most trusted lady-in-waiting, either as comfort or closure. No official record confirms it, of course. But several funeral accounts mention a personal relic of the Queen's choosing, buried in the palm of her right hand. And let's be honest, if your dad had your mother executed when you were 2, you'd probably want something to hold onto at the end too. Still, historians argue whether any of it's true. There's no surviving list of her burial inventory. Nothing public, no neat museum records, just scattered diaries, second-hand letters, and a centuries-long game of royal telephone. But the rumors stuck, as rumors do. What is documented, however, is the way her funeral effigy was dressed. And here's the fascinating bit. Her funeral statue, the one paraded through the streets, wasn't a waxed copy of her corpse. It was idealized, youthful, gorgeous, a recreation of the Elizabeth everyone wanted to remember. The skin was pale but smooth, the hair flame red and vibrant, the eyes half-lidded in eternal serenity. In life, Elizabeth wore a mask of youth. In death, they gave her a literal one. You wonder what the public thought as they watched that regal doll glide through the crowd. Did they think she looked the same beneath the cloth? Or did they know the truth? That her real face was hidden in shadow, painted one last time, and already slipping. And yet, the parade mattered. So did the performance. Because this wasn't just the death of a monarch, was the passing of a symbol. Elizabeth had turned herself into an icon, a kind of walking propaganda machine dressed in pearls and fire. Her gowns were stitched with eyes and ears to show she saw and heard all. Her portraits hid the passage of time with layers of allegory and blush. She curated her legacy obsessively, like a woman applying powder to a wound. So of course her burial had to match. She was placed inside not one, but two coffins, an inner wooden shell, and an outer casing of lead, sealed, heavy, deliberate. The lid was meant to protect her, from rot, from air, from time, but not from myth. Because as soon as the vault was sealed, the legends began to ferment. Some claimed her body hadn't decayed at all, that she lay pristine, almost breathing, her flesh preserved by royal virtue. Others whispered that her features had twisted in death, becoming monstrous, as if God had finally lifted the mask. Fringe writers even proposed that a body double had been buried in her place, the real Elizabeth having died years earlier. You laugh, softly. The Elizabethan clone theory. Wild, yes, but oddly persistent. Why? Because Elizabeth blurred the line between self and symbol, between body and brand. Her motto was Semper Idem, always the same, and she meant it, even if it meant embalming the lie. You shuffle a little closer to the coffin's memory. There's something else you're forgetting, something stitched between the silk and the legacy. Ah, yes, her accessories. In several burial descriptions, there's mention of a coronation orb and scepter, or at least mock versions. These were symbols of statehood and sovereignty, placed beside her as if she'd carry them into the afterlife. The orb, divine authority; the scepter, earthly rule. Together, they said, I'm not done ruling, even underground. And perhaps she wasn't, because, as centuries passed, Elizabeth's burial chamber became more than a grave. It became a shrine, a battleground for national identity, a touchstone for imperial nostalgia. People left flowers, letters. Once, in the 1920s, someone reportedly left a bottle of gin and a note that read, "To the best Queen England ever had. Cheers." You have to admire the dedication, but even her tombstone lies. It doesn't say Queen Elizabeth I. It doesn't list her titles or victories. It simply reads, "Consorts in hope of resurrection." Consorts, plural, because remember, she was buried above her sister Mary, the same Mary she once had imprisoned in the Tower, the same Mary she never forgave. You wonder if that final arrangement was ironic or intentional. Was it political, peace, familial penance, or just a convenient empty vault? Historians still argue about it. What they don't argue about is this: the garments, the objects, the silk and lace. They weren't just ceremonial. They were a fortress, a shroud of dignity wrapped tightly around the messy truth of death. But cloth rots, symbols fade, and the only thing that stays the same is the smell. You take one last look at her imagined body, perfect, preserved, stitched into legend. Then you blink, and you're back underground, with nothing but the coffin, and a faint rustle of silk in the dark. You're starting to understand that history isn't quiet. It rustles. It oozes, and sometimes, it absolutely reeks. The smell hits you again before you even step into the vault. Not just old air, but something alive in its decay. Sharp, sweet, a hint of vinegar and damp roses, like a perfume left too long on a corpse. And once you start noticing it, you can't stop. The smell is part of her story now. Elizabeth's death was many things: political, symbolic, tragic, but above all, it was physical. Her body didn't simply lie still, transformed, and not gracefully. It's easy to forget, when looking at pristine portraits or reciting royal titles, that monarchs decompose, just like the rest of us. And sometimes, even worse. You circle the idea slowly. What does royal rot smell like? There's actually a phrase for it: the odor of sanctity. In medieval Europe, holy figures, who died without a trace of smell or who emitted a pleasant aroma, were said to be blessed. Saints, especially, were expected to go out sweetly. Of course, that standard didn't quite extend to the Tudors. No one called Elizabeth a saint. No one expected her to smell like myrrh and lilies, but they certainly hoped for something less offensive. Unfortunately, the reports suggest otherwise. After her death, the room had to be aired frequently. The windows rarely opened in winter were cracked just slightly, not because of piety, but because the stench was overtaking the velvet hangings. The perfumed linens couldn't compete. The candles burned low, but even beeswax has limits. And here's the paradox. The same substances meant to preserve her likely made the smell worse. Elizabeth's face, always painted with Cerussa white lead cosmetic, had absorbed decades of toxins. That same paint had eaten into her skin while she lived, causing lesions and chronic infections. Now imagine trying to embalm a body whose pores were clogged with metallic poison. Add in rotting gums, internal swelling, and a rush job embalming, and you're basically cooking a Tudor stew. There's a fringe medical theory that makes your stomach turn. Some believe Elizabeth may have died from blood poisoning caused by years of cosmetic absorption. Her body would have already been full of toxins before death, and after death, well, they started seeping out. No amount of rose oil could cover that, and cover it they tried. Embalmers of the era used a mixture of spices and herbs, cloves, cinnamon, lavender, sage. They stuffed them into body cavities, packed them between layers of linen, even stitched sachets into burial garments. Think of it as a royal potpourri pouch for the decomposing queen. But none of it worked. Contemporary records don't speak openly of the odor too disrespectful, too delicate, but they hint. The air was troubled, one visitor reportedly said after entering the chamber. Her Majesty's stillness carried weight and warmth. Weight and warmth, two things you absolutely do not want in a corpse. And then there's the coffin itself. We've talked about lead before, but here's a detail you may not know. When sealed improperly, lead-lined coffins can become pressure chambers. The gases from decomposition, methane, sulfur, ammonia build with nowhere to go. Over time, the casket swells. Sometimes it leaks, sometimes it bursts. You crouch beside the side of Elizabeth's casing, running a finger across the seam. There, it is a faint bubble in the metal, subtle but visible. The lead has warped ever so slightly, not from time, from pressure. This wasn't a coffin, this was a container, and the pressure inside, still active. It's not unheard of. There are documented cases from the 18th and 19th centuries of crypts that burst open from the inside. In Westminster alone, more than one coffin has cracked from gas buildup, sending bits of upholstery, fluid, and bone into neighboring vaults. One Victorian clergyman described entering a lower tomb and finding an unholy slick of black, shining fluid oozing down the stairs. Charming, you can't help but imagine it. Elizabeth, sealed inside for centuries, swelling slightly with every season. Her body gassing slowly beneath the abbey stones, like a forgotten bottle of champagne left in the sun. And what does royalty smell like when it bursts? Apparently, somewhere between mildew and formaldehyde. Eyewitnesses to similar incidents described the scent as overripe, spoiled meat, sour wax, and once hauntingly, perfume turned against itself. You step away from the casket, queasy, but you're not the first. Rumors swirl around every time the abbey undergoes maintenance. Workers complain of headaches, of lingering odors in vault corridors long after the air is cleared. One 20th century electrician reportedly fainted after breaking through a sealed wall and hitting a pocket of bitter air. He said it smelled like roses and rotting fish. What makes the queen's stench worse is what surrounded her. Remember, she wasn't buried alone. Stacked below her quietly, almost resentfully, was her half-sister, Mary, the First Bloody Mary, the Catholic monarch who burned Protestants and was promptly erased by Elizabeth's long, theatrical reign. Their shared tombstone says they lie together in hope of resurrection, but their relationship in life, far from peaceful. You wondered if Mary smelled better. It's morbid, sure, but scholars have asked stranger things. Elizabeth was older when she died, less healthy, less cared for in her final days. Mary, by contrast, died younger and was embalmed with more caution. Some even suggest her body held up better during the 1869 inspection. One cryptokeeper reportedly said her casket was less disturbed. What a polite way to say didn't stink as much. Still, no one smelled good. It wasn't just biology, it was theology. In Elizabeth's era, there was a belief that smell could reflect the state of the soul, that putrid odor marked corruption, moral as well as physical. A bad-smelling corpse wasn't just unpleasant, it was damned, and Elizabeth knew that. She spent her life crafting an image of control, of grace, strength, divinity, and yet, in death, she couldn't control the one thing people always notice, the smell. You take one last inhale through your scarf, it's no use. The scent is in your clothes, in your throat, in your memory. It's not just a coffin anymore, it's a statement. Even now her body is talking, and what it's saying, well, it's a bit rude. The strangest thing about monarchs is where they end up. You'd expect thrones, monuments, maybe a crypt sealed behind velvet ropes and glowing plaques. But for Elizabeth, it's a bit more cramped, humble even. You're standing now over a stone floor in Westminster Abbey, staring at a plaque, no, larger than a dinner tray. It reads, *consorts in hope of resurrection. Beneath your feet, directly under that faintly cracked limestone lie, 2 coffins stacked like luggage. The bottom one belongs to Queen Mary I, the Catholic ruler, Elizabeth, once imprisoned, then replaced, and on top, metaphorically and literally, is Elizabeth. It's a strange arrangement, and you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a mistake. But it wasn't. This burial, this final claustrophobic hierarchy, was deliberate. Let's rewind. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the abbey had a problem. Her tomb wasn't ready. The construction had begun, but it would take years before the white marble effigy and full chapel decor were completed. That was normal. Royal tombs were architectural projects, expensive, symbolic, and never quick. In the meantime, they placed her in the same vault as Mary, already interred beneath the abbey's north aisle. Why there? Some say it was a matter of logistics. Nearby, available, enclosed in stone. Others suggest something more poetic, more pointed. After all, Elizabeth had erased Mary's reign in almost every way. She reversed her religious policies, dismantled her monuments, and even painted over some of her portraits. Elizabeth made sure that Bloody Mary became a historical footnote, cautionary tale of religious fanaticism and female failure. So why would she want to spend eternity above her? Was it mercy, irony, or a final act of royal dominance? Historians still argue whether Elizabeth chose the location, or if James I, her successor, arranged it out of convenience. There's no surviving letter, no dying wish. Just the quiet weight of 2 coffins, and the centuries of speculation they inspired. And here's where it gets stranger. You'd expect Elizabeth to be moved later, once her own tomb was finished. But she wasn't. The builders simply carved a new marker above both queens, and called it a day. It wasn't until decades later, under James I's reign, that a new monument was finally added, complete with an effigy of Elizabeth reclining with scepter and orb. Majestic, regal, and misleading. Because underneath that glorious sculpture, it's still just a shared box. Of all the queens to be stacked in death, these 2 were the least likely roommates. Mary and Elizabeth represented opposing worlds, one devoutly Catholic, the other militantly Protestant, one defined by her Spanish alliances, the other by her English isolation, one martyred by historians, the other mythologized beyond recognition. And yet, here they are, coffin on coffin, sister on sister, fire on ice. There's something almost Shakespearean about it, a royal stage beneath the stones, forever performing silence to the tourists walking unknowingly above. The drama doesn't end with their burial, it just goes underground. You kneel beside the plaque and imagine it opening again. A chisel slides against the seam, a creak, a hiss of stale air. Inside, Elizabeth's coffin lies warped, as you remember. The lead is buckled slightly, the pressure of centuries bending its edge. Mary's is beneath it, undisturbed, heavier than you expect. Her funeral had been simpler, swifter, perhaps more reverent. And you wonder, do their bodies touch? No one knows for certain. The vault is narrow. Stacking royal corpses isn't an exact science. In many cases, the coffins were packed tightly, sometimes even slanted to fit. If the wood has degraded over time, if the pressure has shifted, it's entirely possible that Elizabeth's lead lining now rests directly on Mary's. You imagine their bones brushing across centuries, an accidental shoulder, a fingertip, a queenly nudge. It wouldn't be the strangest thing to happen down here, because burial wasn't always so formal. Plenty of royals have been shifted, relocated, or lost altogether. During the English Civil War, for example, some royal tombs were broken open by parliamentary forces, bodies dragged out, desecrated, tossed into pits. Elizabeth escaped that fate, but just barely. In fact, her tomb may have been protected by one key thing: its smell. There's a note in the Abbey's unofficial maintenance logs, written during a 17th century refurbishment, that speaks of an unpleasant miasma emanating from a nearby crypt. The workers refused to open it fully. They suspected decay, or worse, plague. But the real culprit was probably Elizabeth's lead-lined chamber, slowly leaking its royal gases, a scent that saved a skeleton. You lean closer. The marble around the plaque is worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Tourists walk across it every day, snapping photos, checking maps. Most don't even notice what's beneath them. Just another bit of polished history, clean, sanitized. But the truth is still there, just below the stone, just beneath your shoes. 2 queens, 1 tomb, and an unresolved argument echoing in bone. It's worth noting, by the way, that Elizabeth didn't have to be buried here. Many assumed she'd be placed in Henry VII's Lady Chapel, where her grandfather rested in elaborate Tudor splendor, but instead, she was laid next to the half-sister she once feared, hated, pitied, and, maybe, envied. And that makes the legacy messier, because the Virgin Queen, this icon of solitary strength, of unmarried majesty, isn't alone in death. She's not sealed in a golden chamber or resting beneath her father's grandeur. She's stacked, wrapped in silk, locked in lead, and placed above the very woman she tried to erase. It's symbolic, sure, but also deeply human. Because death doesn't care about image. Tombstones lie, statues flatter, but coffins collapse eventually. And when they do, the truth seeps through. You step back from the plaque, dust your hands off. Above you, the Abbey bells ring faintly. Below you, history sleeps with a faint whiff of spite. You try not to fixate on the lid, but it's warped now just slightly. Lead doesn't like time. It bows, swells, reacts to air, and pressure like skin to age. And that's the metaphor, isn't it? Her coffin is her last mask. Stiff, heavy, gilded, but not immortal. You remember what you saw earlier: the ring, the lace, the fragments of jawbone, all cradled in the stink of half-failed preservation. But something didn't sit right. Not just the gas, not just the rot. It's her bones. They were not quite as expected. Elizabeth was famously petite, but strong. She stood maybe 5'3" in her heel-staller in presence. But the skeletal remains in the coffin seemed smaller still, slightly curved, almost fragile. Not like a woman who outlasted half of Europe. You go digging not through the coffin again, but through archives. There was a moment, during one of the quiet 19th century inspections, when a royal historian allegedly noted that the remains bore signs of notable curvature. He chalked it up to the position of burial, but another, more speculative journal published, anonymously claimed something far more tantalizing, that the queen's spine may have been deformed, a mild scoliosis. Perhaps more. It's never been confirmed. No formal study has been allowed, but it opens a strange possibility that Elizabeth, known for her towering strength and commanding presence, may have spent her life hiding something more than wrinkles or grief. She may have been in constant pain. It would explain the endless standing, the refusal to be still, the layers of gowns and ruffs designed not just for drama, but for armor. Her fashion wasn't just about vanity. It was about scaffolding. Some suggest her corsets were worn tighter than most, stiffened, not only with whalebone but with fine metal ribbing, designed not only to cinch the waist, but to brace the spine, to keep her upright. A queen held up not by blood or divinity, by steel and silk. And now, in the coffin, those bones sag again, no longer braced, no longer dressed, no longer performing. You reach back into her past, following the line of her body through time. The early portraits don't help much. They're notoriously inaccurate, more myth than mirror. Even in her youth, Elizabeth's paintings were manipulated to project health and control. Long fingers, swan's neck, upright posture. They read more like fashion plates than likenesses. And later, the famous Armada portrait shows her standing tall, hand resting calmly on a globe, gaze fixed toward destiny. Her waist impossibly narrow, her sleeves heavy with jewels. But look closely. Her left shoulder is slightly higher than her right. Her head tilts, not with elegance, but perhaps with necessity. You blink. Could this be a sign? Or are you seeing ghosts in paint? Historians still argue whether Elizabeth had any deformity at all. Some believe the stories are pure inventionally Victorian sensationalism designed to humanize an unreachable monarch. Others, though, point to her health records: headaches, fatigue, chronic insomnia, refusals to lie in bed. That last detail always returns. In her final days, Elizabeth refused to lie down. She stood or leaned, propped, with pillows, pacing when she could. Was it a sign of spiritual resistance or physical necessity? You begin to suspect her body was her most guarded state secret. Think about it. She never allowed a full medical exam. Her physicians reported to her, not the court. Her coronation. Robes were padded not just for drama, but for concealment. And later in life, she wore gloves constantly. Some assumed it was vanity hiding age spots, but others whispered about tremors, or joint pain, or swelling. One servant once remarked that her shoes were so narrow, they bloodied the feet. Another claimed her gowns required 4 to 6 pins to brace the lower back. These comments passed without scandal, but taken together, they begin to outline a woman not simply regal, but braced, managed, bound by clothing, not for beauty, but for control. And yet, she never faltered in public. She danced, even in old age. She stood, for hours, at court. She rode on horseback in parades. All of it carefully choreographed. Yes, but undeniably strenuous. It's possible she endured chronic pain for decades and never let it show, which makes the bones in that coffin more tragic, because whatever scaffolding she relied on, crown, ceremony, it's gone now. The spine that once held the weight of an empire now lies slack, bowed slightly with the burden of time. You imagine her collapsing in slow motion, not on a battlefield, not on a throne, but in layers of velvet, alone in a cold palace, her back aching, her crown slightly tilted. There's one last clue. During a secretive 1930s conservation project, a floor stone near her vault was briefly lifted, not fully, just enough to peek beneath. The workers claimed a sharp chemical odor rose instantly, like a warning, but one also noted the presence of a brace, fragment trusted, thin, caught in the stone seam. A brace. or a corset stay, a remnant of the body beneath the myth. Of course, that record disappeared, never published, only a mention in the footnotes of a private letter. Dismissed, forgotten, denied. Because people don't want to think of Elizabeth as weak. They want the storm-eyed virgin, the steel-tempered orator, the fairy queen, not a woman held up by pins and pain. But history is a grave. And sometimes, when you dig deep enough, you find the truth was always bent. Not broken, just curved, quietly, permanently, like a spine beneath a crown. You don't expect it, but your next clue isn't in stone, or silk, or liddits and teeth. Or rather, the ghost of them. They're still there, barely. A few molars clinging stubbornly to the back of her jawbone, yellowed, cracked, worn down like pebbles under centuries of tide. No one wants to talk about a queen's teeth, but they say more than her speeches ever did. You lean closer. The enamel is grooved, the nerves long gone, and in those ridges, you read the story of her appetites, her pain, and yes, her fear. Let's start with the obvious. Elizabeth had terrible dental health. By the end of her life, her teeth were reportedly black. Not just stained, but rotted. So much so, that foreign ambassadors wrote home about it. Her Majesty's speech is clouded by her condition, one courtier delicately put. Translation: she was hard to understand through the pain. And yet, she smiled. Because image mattered more than comfort. More than hygiene. More than breath that could probably kill a rose garden from 20 paces. What made it worse? Sugar Elizabeth had a sweet tooth that would terrify modern dentists. Sugared almonds, candied violets, preserved fruits, honey-glazed meats. She consumed sugar the way some monarchs used gold, lavishly, excessively, almost religiously. It was a status symbol. In 16th century England, sugar wasn't just a treat, it was a flex. Imported, expensive, exotic. If you had sugar, you were somebody. If your teeth were black from it. Even better, it meant you could afford decay. You imagine her at banquets, gnawing carefully on rose-petal jellies and spiced marmalade, her tongue tiptoeing around aching gums. The pain, ignored, masked with wine and wit. She laughed through ulcers, whispered through abscesses. Historians still argue whether she ever had dental surgery. Some say yes, a tooth pulled near the end of her reign by a reluctant court barber, with no anesthetic and no dignity. Others claim she forbade such invasions, that her pain was private, her mouth a locked vault, like her heart. What is certain, by the time of her death, she had trouble eating and speaking. The woman who once commanded fleets with her voice, no rasped like parchment. That's what you're looking at now. Not just teeth, but silence. You remember the story of one visitor to court who remarked that Elizabeth only ate soft bread and broths in her final year. She would chew slowly, sometimes dipping foods in wine to soften them. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brought them to her lips, but she never let them see her wince. The court, of course, pretended not to notice, as always, even when her jaw swelled, even when she began wearing veils more frequently, ostensibly for fashion, but perhaps to hide infection. There's a fringe theory that she developed osteomyelitis, a bone infection of the jaw, that untreated, would have been agonizing. If that's true, it explains a lot. The thinness, the erratic mood swings, the refusal to speak for long periods, even the decision not to lie down. When your jaw is rotting, every movement hurts. Every heartbeat pulses through bone, and yet, she painted her face white. She wore rubies in her ears. She kept the illusion intact, until the very end. You glance back into the coffin, and something catches the light. It's a hairpin, or what's left of one, gold twisted into the shape of a Tudor rose, still wedged near the skull, tangled in what might once have been hair. That's not an accident. That's vanity, held tightly even in death. And you think of mirrors. Elizabeth was obsessed with them. She had dozens, full-length, handheld, polished to silver-bright gleam. But in her final months, she supposedly ordered every mirror in her chambers removed, covered, smashed. She didn't want to see what was happening to her face. It's one of the most repeated legends about her death. And it's one of the saddest, not because she feared dying, but because she feared looking like she was dying. Because queens weren't allowed to rot. You go deeper. There are apothecary records from the late 1500s listing salves and mouthwashes made specifically for her grace's comfort. Ingredients included mint, vinegar, myrrh, sage, and powdered alum. Not dental care. Disguises. One even contained ground pearls. Pearls. As if royalty could polish decay into grace. The irony. All of it probably made things worse. Lead in her face cream. Dot sugar on her tongue. Mercury in her balms. It wasn't just poor hygiene. It was chemical warfare waged daily by a queen against her own body. You can still see it in the jawbone. A darkened streak along the upper molars. Possibly a drain channel. Possibly an abscess crater. Either way, it whispers the truth. She hurt, and no one dared say it. Not to her, not about her, not until now. Because pain isn't part of the Elizabethan myth. The myth is all fire and pearls and Gloriana, riding into battle with a lion on one side and a harp on the other. But this is the truth she buried in her mouth. It's not just teeth. It's testimony of survival, of silence, of swallowing everything, even blood, if it meant staying queen one more day. You close your eyes and let the silence settle. No more speeches, no more smiles. Just the echo of rot beneath a gilded crown. You hear it before you see it. A faint flutter, like parchment disturbed in a breeze. But there's no wind down here. Just stone, stillness, and memory. And yet something shifts. Something fragile. You turn, and there it is. Paper. Not much. Just a few scraps tucked deep in a corner of the vault, where the light barely reaches. You wouldn't have noticed them if you hadn't leaned down. They're brittle, brown at the edges, curled like autumn leaves. It's a wonder they survived at all, and you already know what they are. Letters, or the ghost of them. Most are too damaged to read, but one pressed beneath a shard of broken funeral cloth is legible enough to break your heart. My grace, may heaven keep thee in fire and frost alike. You pause. It's unsigned, no date. But the style is unmistakably Tudor. You can almost hear the voice behind it, warm, formal, careful. Someone who loved her, or feared her, or both. It could be from a courtier, a lady in waiting, a confidant. It could even be from herself. Yes, she wrote to herself sometimes. In the margins of psalters and Latin primers, Elizabeth would jot prayers, half-poems, lines from Seneca or Ovid twisted into personal reflections. Little coded whispers from a woman who was always performing, even in solitude. You imagine her sitting at a window, the Thames fog curling against the glass, pen in hand, jaw throbbing, and yet still composing. I am called Gloriana, but I dream of silence. Because letters were her escape. She wrote constantly. Orders, threats, confessions. Thousands of pages passed through her hands, each one a performance of strength. But it was in the private ones, in the barely saved scraps and secret exchanges, that the mask sometimes slipped. There's one famous letter she wrote to Mary, Queen of Scots. It reads like a plea and a warning tangled together. She calls Mary sister, but the ink is ice cold. You have forced my hand, she writes, just before having Mary executed. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth wept afterward, whether she screamed, or just sat in silence with a blank page in front of her, not knowing what to write next. Because that was the thing about Elizabeth. She was never fully honest in public, but her paper trail tells on her. Take the Tilbury speech. You know the one, the famous line. Asterisk, I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. It's recited like scripture now, plastered on school walls, carved into monuments. But there's something historians don't tell you. There's no confirmed transcript of that speech from the day she gave it. The version we know, it was written down later, possibly edited, possibly rehearsed. And some even claim it was written before the event entirely as a kind of stage script, designed to be remembered. So did she really say those words? Or did she simply want us to believe she had? That's the trick with letters and speeches. They can be both truth and costume, like a dress worn only once, just long enough to be painted. But sometimes, the paper forgets to lie. One scrap in the archives preserved under a false name, 4 centuries dales her thoughts on aging. The ink is blurred by what some claim was water. Others believe it was tears. In it, she writes, "I wither, and yet bloom still in their eyes. They love my shadow, but not my skin." That line hits differently when you're staring at her bones. Because this coffin, this warped capsule of decay, is the shadow she feared becoming. You shift the crumbling page aside and see something else beneath it. A seal, red wax, smeared and chipped, but still visible. It bears the Tudor rose, with the faintest impression of a fingerprint beside it. Small, delicate, likely hers, and suddenly it feels like you're trespassing. Because these aren't just artifacts, they're confessions. Left behind, not for history, but in spite of it. Trapped beneath marble, smothered by myth. People always talk about Elizabeth's love life for her lack thereof. The Virgin Queen, untouched, unattached, untouchable. But the real intimacy, it's right here, between the folds of letters no one was meant to read. There's another fragment, just one line, asterisk, "He smiled at me with Spain behind his teeth." Historians believe it refers to the Duke of Anjou. Others say it's about Robert Dudley. But whoever it was, the weight behind it is undeniable. Elizabeth knew how dangerous affection could be. She danced with power because love was too sharp. She couldn't afford it. Not as a woman, not as a monarch. So she wrote around it. She buried it in poetry, coded her longing into metaphors. Let it seep into ink the way it now seeps into bone. You hold the last scrap up to the dim light. It's nearly gone. Just for words. Asterisk still. I remain yours. That's it. Not a queen, not a title, not even a name. Just yours. It hits harder than any crown ever could. Because beneath all the speeches, the portraits, the lace and blood and ceremony, Elizabeth was still just a woman trying to hold something, anything, that belonged only to her. And that's the tragedy of royalty. Not the power, not the pressure, not even the loneliness. It's the silence. The kind you find at the bottom of a coffin, pressed between old lace and paper hearts. There's a painting they never hung. It was found decades after Elizabeth's death, in a private chamber of one of her lesser-known palaces, possibly Richmond, possibly Hatfield. Experts still debate its origins. Some claim it was done in her final years, others say it was posthumous. But everyone agrees on one thing: it was hidden for a reason. You've seen the copies, the bright ones, cleaned up for textbooks and documentaries. But the original, it's something else entirely. Elizabeth stands alone, not with victory ships or allegorical roses. Not floating in divinity, just standing, hollow-cheeked eyes dark, but alert, the skin around her mouth creased, like paper crumpled and carefully smoothed again. No pearls, no crown, just a faded red gown, slightly wrinkled at the hips. Her hands are clasped, bare, and behind her almost unnoticed is a clock. Midnight. It's not subtle, but nothing about her late portraits ever was. You study the image now, from a reproduction pinned beside the vault. It was rephotographed once in the 1930s before vanishing into a private collection. Some say it's in a country house in Yorkshire. Others think it was destroyed in the Blitz. Maybe it was buried, like so much of her truth, but the image lingers. Elizabeth, at the edge of the stage, as the curtain begins to fall. What's haunting about the painting isn't her weariness. It's the asterisk stillness. She looks done, not defeated, just finished. And that wasn't the image she wanted. Elizabeth controlled her likeness with obsessive precision. In 1596, she issued the proclamation touching portraits, a royal order forbidding any artist from painting her unseemly. Only pre-approved images could circulate. Painters who disobeyed risked punishment or worse, royal disfavor. You wonder how many portraits were destroyed, burned, painted over. How many real faces of Elizabeth were scraped away by courtly fear. But this one survived. And that survival tells you more than the portrait itself. Because even in death, her image still slips. The cracks show, the oil thins, the truth bleeds through the lacquer. And what's underneath? A woman who aged. Not glamorously, not tragically, just truthfully. You return your attention to the coffin. The lighting shifts as you move, casting faint golden glimmers on the interior. And in one corner, you see something strange, a faint impression in the lining, almost like a fold where cloth once pressed against a face, a mask. You check the records. One of the Abbey inventories from the 1700s lists a funerary facepiece, molded in wax, presumed likeness of Gloriana. It disappeared during renovations, in the 19th century. There's no official explanation, but the rumor, it melted, left too close to a heat source. The wax softened, sagged, the features ran like candle tears, eyes gone, lips drooped. One cheek collapsed inward, leaving only a dented ridge where a once iconic nose had been. You imagine it, that silent collapse, the queen, melting after death like she never dared in life. It sounds poetic, until you realize how deeply it fits her story. Because Elizabeth's entire reign was a mask, a carefully fitted performance. The Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, the one woman above all men. It was theater. Genius theater, but theater nonetheless. And beneath it, exhaustion, doubt, maybe fear. The closer you look, the more the costume unravels. Not just in paintings or death masks, but in her final behaviors. The last months of her life were shrouded in mystery. She isolated herself, refused to be touched, refused famously, even to lie down. She stood for hours, days, some say leaning against pillows, refusing food, refusing comfort, as if to do so would admit defeat. People thought she was mad, but maybe she was just tired of pretending. You picture her wandering the palace halls, shadow trailing, hair thinned, corset loosened just enough to breathe. No ceremony, no pier, just a woman slipping between the cracks of her mirth. And in that fading, something strangely brave. Because there are two ways to be powerful. You can roar, or you can refuse to bow. Elizabeth chose both. At Tilbury, she roared, sword in hand, fire in her speech. But in those final weeks when her teeth ached, her spine curved, her bones rattled beneath velvet, she chose the second path. No bed, no tears, no final public statement, just refusal. She let the myth speak for her, while her body quietly unraveled. It's ironic. For someone so obsessed with time, its symbolism, its weight, she left no clock running at the end. No final painting, no deathbed confession, only silence, and a slightly crooked coffin. And yet, time keeps moving. The dust settles, the lacquer fades, the scent seeps, and the portrait, the real one, not the oil-painted propagandies, waiting beneath it all. Not glorious, not divine, but human. You stare once more at the printout of the forbidden portrait. Midnight, and in the dark, her hand clenches ever so slightly, as if reaching for something, or letting it go. The trouble with time is that it's always whispering, even in a sealed coffin, even in silence. Now, You find yourself drawn to something deceptively small, tucked just behind Elizabeth's left arm, cradled in the folds of what was once her funeral gown. A ring. It glints, barely. The gold has dulled over the centuries, but it hasn't faded. That's the strange thing about gold. It outlasts breath. You carefully lift it, and even before you see it clearly, you know which ring it is. The one she never removed. The one with a secret hinge. Historians know it as Elizabeth's poison ring, though the name is misleading. There's no actual evidence it held poison, only the possibility. What it did hold was far more intimate. 2 miniatures, hidden beneath a clasp so fine it vanished unless you knew to look. On one side, Elizabeth herself, youthful, crownless, a private portrait, not meant for court display. And opposite her, a woman, dark hair, sad eyes, a dress too plain for nobility. It's her mother, Anne Boleyn. The ring was discovered when Elizabeth died, and her body was prepared for burial. The hinge had grown stiff with age, but when pried open, it revealed the double portrait preserved in perfect, painful detail. You stare at it now. 2 women, joined forever, pressed together in secret. The irony is brutal. Anne Boleyn, executed when Elizabeth was barely 3 years old. Her name scrubbed from history, her portraits destroyed, her lineage branded as dangerous, traitorous, heresy in heels. And yet, for all the silence, Elizabeth kept this tiny image close. Not publicly, not politically, just on her finger. That's the part that matters. Because Elizabeth never spoke of her mother, not in letters, not in speeches. If pressed, she would pivot, praise her Tudors, quote her father, speak of England like it was her only parent. But the ring, that was her whisper. A daughter holding her mother's face in the dark. You feel the weight of that now, heavier than any crown, and it explains so much. Why she never married, why she trusted so few, why she clung to control like breath. Because when you're born to a scandal, you don't just inherit power, you inherit erasure. And surviving erasure means one thing above all: you never let anyone write your story for you again. That's what Elizabeth did. Every portrait she approved, every speech she rehearsed, every law she passed, poem she gifted, flirtation she weaponized, it was all authorship. She was writing herself into permanence. But the ring, that was the chapter she didn't share. Anne Boleyn, remembered not as queen, not as scandal, not even as martyr, but simply as asterisk mother. Historians still argue how Elizabeth felt about Anne. Some claim she internalized the court's shame, that she kept her distance to maintain legitimacy. Others insist she honored her mother quietly, protecting Anne's memory the only way she could, by surviving longer than anyone else. But this ring that changes things. Because you don't wear a woman's face on your skin for 44 years unless she means everything to you. And Elizabeth wore it to her death. That raises new questions. Was it her decision to be buried with the ring? Or was it overlooked, lost in the folds of mourning cloth, clasped tightly in rigor mortis? Did she mean for the secret to be discovered? Or was it simply the one part of her she couldn't bear to part with? You turn the ring over. The enamel has chipped slightly, revealing the gold beneath. There's an inscription around the outer band, but it's mostly worn. Only 2 words remain legible. Cor meum, my heart. Not a state motto, not a political slogan, just that. And it's not for England, it's for Anne. Suddenly, everything sharpens. The loneliness, the suspicion, the theatrical control of image in court and body. Elizabeth wasn't just guarding her power, she was guarding a wound. One no one could see, one no one could name. She wasn't just England's queen, she was her mother's ghost. Walking proof that Anne Boleyn had asterisk mattered. Not because of scandal, not because of execution, but because her daughter refused to forget her. You remember a line from one of Elizabeth's private poems, one that survived only in fragments. Asterisk, they think me marble, but I am wax within, and fire under that. Wax within, like the portrait in the ring, like the funerary mask that melted. She built walls, but inside, she burned. That's what the ring proves, that even in the chambers of monarchy, in the thrones, and tombs, and sermons of state, there's always a private life, always a heartbeat beneath the politics, and sometimes, it's a daughter, wearing her mother like a prayer. You place the ring back into the folds of her gown, letting it rest beside what might have once been her hand. There's no blood left, no skin. But somehow, the connection still hums. Not royal, not divine, just human. And for the first time, you realize Elizabeth wasn't just the end of a dynasty. She was its echo. And this ring the size of a thumbnail, hidden in death, the loudest thing she ever said, "There's something wrong with the wood." You crouch lower and run your fingers along the base of the coffin where the lead buckles in, where the wood once met velvet, now long devoured. It flakes in your hand, splinters. But that's not what catches your breath. It's the smell. Not the stench of rot or time, but something chemical, sharp, medicinal, unnatural. A tang that clings to the back of your throat, stirs something in your memory, and then it hits you. This coffin doesn't just rot, it fights it. Preservatives, the old kind, the kind no one uses anymore because we learned too late how dangerous they really were. But back then, they were cutting edge, literally royal. You lean in and spot the residue along the inner lining, brownish gray streaks, hardened into the weave. That's not mold, that's calomel and turpentine, and possibly as definitely arsenic. The Queen's coffin was poisoned to preserve her, which is a sentence that should feel absurd, and yet, here it is. Arsenic embalming wasn't common in Elizabeth's time, but it was known, especially among alchemists, court physicians, and certain European funeral experts imported for noble burials. It was expensive, experimental, risky, and exactly the kind of gamble Elizabeth's handlers would have taken, because she couldn't just die. She had to remain. Even in death, her image mattered. Her decay had to be delayed, as if her body, like her crown, could resist the pull of common ruin. So they soaked her, not in roses or resins, like the ancients, but in poison. You step back, dizzy for a moment, because you realize this. Elizabeth didn't just live in a cage of ceremony and costume. She died in one, too. Her final sleep wasn't natural. It was curated, controlled, toxic, and now, centuries later, it's still seeping from the seams of her coffin, curling along the flagstones of the abbey like a bitter perfume. But the story doesn't stop there, because when you check the embalming records, you find something stranger. Conflicting notes. 2 sets of instructions. 1 English. 1 Foreign. The English physician Dr. Rodney Smythe recommended a simple treatment, linen soaked in alcohol and wrapped tightly, with rosemary and lavender pressed between folds. Respectful, traditional. But the second set of notes, there in French, signed by a man called D. Merrills, rumored to have come from the Valois court, a consultant brought in secretly. His recommendation, a blend of spirits, minerals, and metal salts, designed to halt decay entirely. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's body was treated by both men. Some say de Merrills was dismissed. Others claim his methods were used against advice, and that's what caused the later gas incident when the coffin was disturbed. The chemicals reacted. Pressure built, hence the warped lead, the burst of foul air, the panic. But here's the real mystery. Why 2 embalmers? Why bring in a foreigner with risky methods for a queen whose body was never meant to be moved? And then you remember James, Elizabeth's successor, a king with no love for the woman who'd kept him away from England for decades. A king who saw Elizabeth not as a glorious matriarch but as an obstacle, an embarrassment, a relic. It's possible he wanted her out of sight, sealed, neutralized, made inert, poison her corpse, and you poison the memory. Or maybe, just maybe he was afraid of her, afraid she would haunt his court, even in death. That her popularity would outshine his reign, that her bones would whisper in the halls of Westminster, reminding everyone who the real sovereign was. So he had her locked, pickled, buried in borrowed space. No tomb of her own, just a shared vault and a melting mask. You kneel again beside the coffin, looking at the faint chalk markings left by past inspections. Roman numerals, curved initials. Someone, at some point, tried to catalog this body, to reduce her to dust and data, but she refused. Elizabeth, who mastered appearances, who never let them see her bleed, left one final defense. A body so toxic, it defied even decomposition. You touch the edge of the coffin and whisper a thought you didn't expect. Was this what she wanted? To be unreadable? To remain as stubborn in death as in life? You picture her smiling, thin, coy, iron in her spine, lead in her lipstick, gold on her hand. Let them try to bury me, she might have said. Let's see how long I last. And here she is. Still dangerous, still leaking, still queen. You rise slowly, careful not to inhale too deeply. The air isn't deadly anymore, but you can taste the warning in it, because this isn't just embalming, it's vengeance. A body turned into a statement, not to be touched, not to be trifled with, not to be forgotten. Somewhere above you beyond the vault, the marble, and the memory tourists shuffle through the abbey with quiet reverence. Pausing to snap pictures of plaques and stained glass, they look down at the stone that marks Elizabeth's resting place, whispering her name like it's a legend. But they have no idea what's actually beneath their feet. Because here, in the tomb itself, you've found something that changes the narrative entirely. Not a crown, not a document, not even a relic, just a shoe, or rather, what's left of one, tucked behind the curve of her lower leg, half shielded by disintegrated petticoats, lies the flattened skeleton of a slipper. Leather turned to parchment. Sole collapsed. No heel, no embroidery. It doesn't match the grandeur of the woman above. It looks ordinary, and it shouldn't be here. Royal burials were always lavish. Shoes were symbolic. Elizabeth's effigies show her in gem-studded footwear, sometimes even clothed gold slippers. This is plain, unadorned, maybe even asterisk used, which makes it a problem. You examine it more closely. The lining is padded, but worn through at the toe. The back is split, as if it had been slipped on hastily, over and over again. And there, near the arch, barely visible, a stitch mark. Tiny, intentional, possibly a repair. You can't stop the thought from blooming. Was this hers? Not her burial shoe, not her public shoe, but her personal shoe, a favorite pair, something she wore in private, where no ambassadors or painters could see her shuffle. That would mean someone buried her in comfort, or pity, and that someone would have had to be close, trusted, intimate enough to override tradition in her final hours. Maybe her ladies-in-waiting, maybe Cat Ashley's successors, maybe someone who remembered that behind the thrones and speeches, Elizabeth Tudor was still just a woman with aching feet. It sounds small, but it isn't, because history is obsessed with her image. The towering figure, the virgin queen, the goddess in pearls and armor. But this shoe says something else. It says her feet hurt, that she walked, paced, stood for hours in court without rest, that her shoes wore thin because she used them. This isn't power, this is cost. You remember that Elizabeth famously stood for her final portrait, refused a chair, refused to show weakness, even as her knees shook and her attendants begged her to rest. She insisted, "I am still your queen. I shall stand as long as I breathe." Maybe this shoe was what let her do that. A soft insole, a trusted fit, a quiet rebellion against the unbearable expectations of monarchhood. Historians often skip over fashion details like this, lest they sparkle. But Elizabeth's clothing was strategy. Her slippers, they were armor. She once wrote to a tailor, furious that a new pair of shoes pinched a toe and caused a cruel discomfort. She wasn't being dramatic, she was being tactical, because every inch of her body was political, even her walk. You imagine her pacing her private chambers, in this very pair, not gliding like in the portraits, but limping slightly, frowning, thinking, muttering to herself about Spain, or Dudley, or another false promise from Parliament. And in those moments, this slipper was her only luxury, worn, soft, forgiving. You think back to an old court rumor that Elizabeth kept her favorite pair of slippers hidden under her bed and refused to let anyone clean them, that she once slapped a servant who tried. These, she supposedly said, know me. It's probably apocryphal, but now, staring at this artifact, you're not so sure, because this slipper does know her, more than the crown, more than the throne, more than the portraits. It remembers the weight of her, and that's something no effigy can capture. You turn it gently and find one more surprise. Inside, stitched faintly in dark thread, are two initials. E.R. Elizabeth Regina. It's almost too perfect. A secret signature, hidden where only she would see it, where her foot would press against it daily. A reminder perhaps to herself that she wasn't just a woman. She was the queen, not in the eyes of others, but in the soles of her own feet. It gives you chills, because this tiny act as hidden name tells you that Elizabeth knew her power, but she also knew her limits, and she protected them, guarded her comfort, honored her pain, even if the world refused to see it. And now, centuries later, in this damp tomb filled with gas and ghosts, she's telling you again, not with a speech, not with a sword, but with a shoe. And maybe that's more honest than anything carved in Latin marble above her, because this isn't myth. This is friction. This is what happens when a woman carries a country on her back, and still finds a way to walk through it. You place the slipper back where you found it, carefully, tenderly, not because it's fragile, but because she isn't, and maybe never was. You sit back on your heels for a moment, letting the cool air press against your face, and you realize something odd. For all the objects, the clues, the bones, and cloth and poison, there's still something asterisk missing. Something that should have been here. A book. There's no Bible in the coffin. And that's strange, because in Elizabeth's time, being buried without a religious text, especially for a monarch, was nearly unthinkable. The Book of Common Prayer, or at the very least, a small psalter, was often placed with the deceased, not for reading, of course, but as a gesture, a symbol of piety, continuity, devotion. But Elizabeth, nothing, no silk-bound scripture, no prayer book tucked beneath her folded hands, not even a single pressed page tucked inside her gown. You check the burial inventory again. Nothing is listed. The clergy recorded her robes, her effigy, the crown placed on her coffin during the procession, but no Bible. Which opens up a question no one really wants to ask. Did she choose to go without one? You glance around at the vault. Stone, silence, no iconography, no carved angels or saints. Just a bare, Protestant severity of English Reformation ideals. And Elizabeth, at the center of it all, surrounded by nothing but lead and dark. It's easy to forget how much of her reign was about not taking sides. She was Protestant, yes, but cautiously. Politically, she refused to be painted as a zealot, refused to persecute like her sister Mary, refused to bow to Rome, refused even to marry a Catholic prince, though many begged her to. Her religion wasn't devout, it was diplomatic. She attended services, yes, she had a bishop by her side, but she also kept Catholic images in her private chambers for decades, and some claim she still lit votive candles in secret, long after the Reformation had outlawed them. So when it came time for burial, who made the call? No book, no cross, no visible prayer, just silence. Was it modesty or defiance? Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's personal beliefs leaned toward Puritan simplicity or concealed Catholic ritual. Some claim her final confession, heard by the Archbishop of Canterbury, was rehearsed, that she refused the sacrament, that she wouldn't say the words out loud. And if that's true, if she chose to die without ritual, what does that mean? Maybe it means this, that her real faith wasn't in God at all. It was in image, in survival, in legacy. Think about it. She reigned over a country torn apart by religious war, a father who switched faiths for a son, a mother executed under the banner of heresy, a sister who burned Protestants alive, and a cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded in the name of divine right. Why would Elizabeth trust any church after that? She was raised in doubt, sanctified by chaos. No wonder she kept her beliefs to herself. No wonder she slipped out of this world without holy pages in her hands. Her truth, like everything else, was buried. Maybe her silence was her only prayer. But there's another possibility, that someone took the Bible after the burial, removed it, for politics or profit. Rare books go missing, even from royal tombs. There are whispers of a small Tudor psalter that turned up in a London auction house in the 1890s, bound in red velvet, missing its ownership page, but marked with marginalia in an unusually sharp feminine hand. One line, written beside Psalm 56, reads, "In God I do not trust, but I shall not fear." It raised eyebrows, then it disappeared again. Private collection, never seen since. Was it hers? No way to know, but it fits, because fear, not faith, was Elizabeth's shadow companion. She ruled alongside it, danced with it, mastered it, and when death came, she didn't cling to holy words. She faced the void like she did everything else, alone, composed, unsentimental, and yet, you still can't shake the feeling that something sacred should be here. Not a priest's gift, not a state offering, but something personal. A page, a note, a favorite line. Even the most hardened rulers kept verses near at the end, not because they were devout, but because poetry helps when the body fails. Maybe Elizabeth's verse wasn't from scripture. Maybe it was her own. A line she whispered once into her pillow and never spoke aloud again. The sun sets even on marble. Or maybe she didn't need words at all, just the knowledge that her story, however brutal, however buried, would still be told. And here you are, telling it, in the silence where a book should be, in the absence that says more than presence ever could. She left no page, so you became one. There's a knock, distant, echoing through the stone like a breath caught in time. But it's not real, not present, it's memory. Because here, in this place where Elizabeth lies, there's another voice buried too. Not in the tomb, not in flesh, but in history's waiting room. She was never meant to be seen again, and yet she waits beside Elizabeth even now. Mary, Queen of Scots. You tilt your head, puzzled, because Mary was buried far from here. Executed at Fotheringhay. First laid to rest in Peterborough, then moved years later by her son James to a grand tomb in Westminster. A separate vault, a separate legacy, but only a few paces away. And that's the irony. These two women, rival reflections, survivors of the same brutal chessboard, now share eternal walls. Elizabeth, Mary, locked in death as they never were in life. You shift, suddenly aware that every breath you take now is brushing past the ghosts of both queens. And the rivalry wasn't just political, it was personal. Elizabeth never met Mary face to face. Not once. Not even when their lives entwined. In letters, spies, threats, and court theater. Their relationship was written in ink, and sealed with suspicion. And yet, in the coffin, something of Mary lingers. Because the fabric inside Elizabeth's casket, the fragment you found earlier, the velvet with foreign embroidery, doesn't match Tudor patterns. It matches French ones. Specifically, mid-16th century brocade used in the Valois court. The same court where Mary was raised. The same court that gave her the scent of roses and the habit of writing poetry into the hems of her dresses. It's just possible that a swatch of Mary's world made it into Elizabeth's coffin, a scrap of cloth once exchanged, or stolen, or slipped in, quietly, by a sympathetic hand. Historians would scoff, but the symbolism is too delicious to ignore. The Protestant queen, buried with a Catholic thread, the Virgin Queen wrapped in fabric, once touched by the woman she executed. Because yes, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. Reluctantly, politically, but deliberately. She waited weeks to do it. And then, when Mary was finally dead, she flew into a fury not at the deed, but at the speed. She claimed the order had been carried out too fast, that she hadn't meant it to happen. Historians still argue whether she meant it, but the result was the same. A queen killed by another queen, and now they rest together. Maybe that was James's revenge. Not loud, not public, but symbolic. Place them close. Make them stare at each other through stone. Let history settle the score. But here's the twist. Elizabeth may have respected Mary more than anyone else. Feared her? Yes, but respect? Absolutely. Because Mary had what Elizabeth never did: a child, a direct heir, a continuation, and that made Mary powerful in a way Elizabeth could never duplicate. It terrified her, and perhaps, in a corner of her heart, it moved her. You recall a letter Mary wrote from captivity, pleading for mercy, signing it, from one queen to another, with hope still in my hand. There's no evidence, Elizabeth responded. But you find yourself wondering if she read it more than once, if she tucked it somewhere, if she touched the ink with trembling fingers and thought, this is what it means to be seen, because no one else saw her, not like Mary did. They were mirrors, both crowned too young, both betrayed by men, both raised in the shadow of greater dynasties, expected to perform femininity and power like a costume stitched too tight. And now, 2 coffins, 2 women, 1 silence. You press your palm to the stone between them, cold, unmoving, but the pressure hums, and you feel something strange. Not grief, recognition. Elizabeth and Mary weren't enemies. They were twins, split by religion and geography, forced into conflict by the machinery of monarchy. But here, in the stillness, their stories bleed together. And maybe that's the real tragedy, that history made them rivals, when in another life, another century, they might have been allies, sisters, even, drinking wine in a quiet garden, arguing over poetry, laughing about how ridiculous men are, sending secret letters, not out of fear, but delight. But they weren't given that. They were given thrones, and thrones demand blood. Now they share a ceiling. Their voice is gone, but their weight still here. And as you step away from the coffin, the velvet under your foot wrinkles, slightly the same velvet that might have known both their hands. You look back one last time and whisper, no more letters, no more lies, just rest, at last. There's one final thing you haven't opened. It rests at the foot of the coffin, wedged tightly beneath the crumpled fabric folds of what once might have been an underskirt. You nearly missed it the first time, just another warped edge, another lump of royal decay. But now, with everything else unearthed, it calls to you. A box. Small, wooden, barely the length of your hand, sealed with a tarnished clasp that squeaks when you touch it, resisting like it hasn't been opened in centuries. You hesitate, because this isn't official. This wasn't listed in the burial records. It's not a reliquary or a saint's finger bone, or a jeweled container of monarchic grief. This is personal, unmarked, and you already know, somehow, that it shouldn't be here. You flick the clasp open. It resists, then clicks. Inside, a bundle of hair, human, pale, auburn, braided tightly, neatly, bound at the top with a faded ribbon. You lift it gently, almost reverently, and the strands crackle softly, more like silk thread than anything living. And suddenly you're holding Elizabeth's ghost. Because this hair, this plate is hers, or was. Historians always described her hair as red gold, though that description shifts depending on who's writing. Some say it faded with time. Others claim it was a wig for most of her reign. A few argue she dyed it obsessively, even in her last years, to maintain the illusion of vitality. But this braid, this is no wig. This is intimate, fresh from a brush, twisted by hand, not dressed for court, not woven for display, kept why. You turn the braid gently and spot something even stranger. A note, folded, pressed flat against the inside of the lid, barely legible through the age-stained creases. One line, written in a hand so delicate, it's more drawing than text. Asterisk for when they forget my voice. You blink. It's not a state document, not a declaration, not a signature. It's a whisper. The kind of note someone leaves behind, not for the world, but for one person. Maybe for herself, maybe for a friend, maybe for a future that would never really understand her. And suddenly, everything around you, their portraits, the slippers, the missing Bible feels like scaffolding. Props. This is the core. Because a lock of hair is proof of existence in the most primitive way. Before DNA, before coronations, before statues. Hair says, asterisk, I was here. I touched the world. I left something behind that was entirely mine. And Elizabeth chose to leave asterisk this. Not jewels, not orders, but something from her asterisk body. Deliberate, undeniable. It rewrites the ending. Because think about Itchy, who controlled her image so ferociously, left behind the one thing she could never stage, herself, unedited, a braid from her youth, or from her final days, tied up with a note that says, asterisk, please, don't let me vanish. That's not vanity, that's vulnerability, and it's not for the world. It's for someone like you, someone who might one day crawl through this crypt, dig past the myths, peel away the gold leaf and the church-laced silence, and finally, asterisk, listen. You wonder if it was placed there by her own hands, or by someone else. A maid, a confidant, a woman who loved her, not as a queen, but as a person. Someone who knew her habits. Who braided this hair once while Elizabeth sat half-dressed by a window, listening to birdsong, legs curled beneath her like a girl again. There's no way to prove it, and maybe that's the point, because the crown always told her, asterisk, you must be more than human. But this braid says, I wasn't. Asterisk, it says she had moments of doubt, of loneliness, of aching, visceral desire to be known beyond her myth. You tuck the note back in and close the box gently, not out of fear, but respect, because this isn't an artifact. It's a heartbeat, the most fragile, the most honest piece of Elizabeth Tudor ever left behind. And she hid it in her own grave, not to be found easily, but to be found asterisk eventually, by someone who understood that legacy isn't measured in titles or tombs. It's braided, it's handwritten, it's a secret passed on in quiet, trembling hope that someone will say, I see you. And now, centuries later, you do. You rise slowly, leaving the little box behind, and suddenly every inch of the tomb feels heavier, like the air itself has thickened, congealed with meaning, not because of the artifacts, not because of the secrets, but because of what's not here. There's no monument, no grand sarcophagus carved with angels or lions, no gilded epitaph chiseled in Latin to proclaim her greatness. Not even a crown left behind. Just a coffin, some cloth, a worn velvet slipper, a lock of hair. And yet, this is the woman who shaped an age. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. She who steered England through war and plague and Spanish invasion. Who cultivated poets and pirates in equal measure. Who refused to marry, not out of prudence, but power. And now, she lies in a plain lead shell, buried in someone else's vault, directly beneath the feet of tourists and historians who usually pass her by on their way to tombs that look more impressive. There's a bitter irony to it, because Elizabeth spent her life building an image. She ordered how her portraits were painted. She rewrote her own childhood. She turned her reign into myth and herself into a symbol. She even gave her country a new language of power, one rooted in control and presentation, and still, she was buried beneath her sister, Mary Tudor, the very woman who declared her a bastard, who locked her in the Tower of London, who made her kneel and beg and tremble, not knowing if the next sunrise would bring execution or pardon. And now they share a vault, a Protestant savior, buried beneath the bones of the woman who tried to drag the country back to Rome in chains. You look up toward the stone ceiling above. Imagine the double coffin stacked in this narrow space. Elizabeth beneath, Mary above. It wasn't her choice. When Elizabeth died in 1603, her body lay in state at Whitehall for days, while the new King James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, debated where to put her. He didn't build her a new tomb, didn't construct a cathedral shrine. He simply recycled. Mary's vault at Westminster Abbey was available. Spacious, already dug. So in went Elizabeth, quietly, neatly, underneath the woman she had outlived, outmaneuvered, and, in many ways, overshadowed. Historians still argue whether it was convenience or cruelty. Some say James respected neither woman. Others insist it was an olive branch, an attempt to symbolically reunite a divided kingdom by laying its rival queens to rest together. But either way, the message was clear. Death is democratic. Even a queen ends up buried under her worst chapter. And Elizabeth, so meticulous, so self-authored, never got to choose her ending. That might be the sharpest cut of all, because monuments matter. Tombs speak, and hers was silenced. No carved lion at her feet, like a medieval knight. No angels lifting her soul to heaven, just a shared grave, a borrowed epitaph. It wasn't until years later that her successor, James, begrudgingly ordered a monument above ground, away from the tomb itself. An ornate alabaster affair in the Abbey's Lady Chapel, carved with Latin inscriptions, topped with a gilded effigy. But that wasn't for her. That was for optics, not for tourists. For history books. Because the real Elizabeth, she's still down here, in the dark, forgotten by design. You reach out and trace a finger across the faint etching near the edge of the coffin. It's almost invisible, covered by corrosion and centuries of grime. But if you tilt your light just right, it catches. 2 letters, E.T. You smile. A small one, because of course she left her initials behind. Buried under another queen's shadow, she still found a way to whisper, "I was here." And that's the thing, isn't it? Elizabeth never stopped fighting to be remembered. She couldn't rely on inheritance, or husband, or heirs. She had only one weapon left, asterisk, legacy, and she wielded it like a blade. Every myth you've ever heard, Gloriana, the fairy queen, the warrior in pearls, was her doing, her script. She turned memory into theater, and if the tomb refused to rise to her level, she left clues inside it. A ring, a slipper, a box of hair, a mark of initials. Not a shrine, but a story. Because monuments crumble, statues fade, Latin gets misread and misquoted, but stories survive. And now, you've stepped into hers. Not the official one, not the coronation narrative or the golden speeches, but the quiet one, the hidden one, the one built not of crowns and sermons, but of fabric, Footsteps, sweat, fear, and ink. She knew you'd come, not you, specifically, but someone, someday, to pull back the velvet, crack open the box, read the hairline whispers left between layers of rot and lead, and here you are, listening, seeing her, not as a monarch, but as a person, alone in the dark, not divine, just determined, not crowned, just buried, and still writing. It starts with a rattle, a faint clink beneath the coffin's base, like metal brushing stone. You pause, unsure if it's real, or just nerves playing tricks again, but know it happens once more, sharper this time. You kneel, angle your flashlight down to the very edge where the coffin's lead base has buckled upward from centuries of pressure, and there, half buried in rubble, wedged between fractured tile and soft dusties, something glinting. You reach for it slowly. It's a key, small, iron, rusted at the teeth but still intact, still curved in that deliberate, old-fashioned way that screams secrecy. But what was it for? There's no lock on the coffin, no compartments in the walls, no drawer in the stone. You sit back, turning it over in your hand, feeling its surprising weight. The handle is circular, ornamented with 3 raised dots around, the edge almost like a code or a symbol. You've seen that shape before, not in the coffin, in asterisk portraits. Specifically, one from 1588, Elizabeth, seated in full regalia, her right hand resting not on a scepter or a scroll but on a jewel-studded box with that exact pattern. 3 dots in a ring. The image was dismissed for decades as a symbolic flourish, artistic license. But what if it wasn't? What if the artist painted something real, something she wanted seen, or hidden in plain sight? You remember the nickname for that painting asterisk, the Armada, portrait. Asterisk, painted in celebration after the defeat of the Spanish fleet. It's filled with symbolism. Ships sinking in the background, Elizabeth triumphant in white. But now, you're looking at the one detail no one ever questioned. A locked box, held deliberately, guarded, and maybe, just maybe, that box wasn't metaphor. Maybe it was this coffin's twin, a container for something so private, so dangerous, that it had to be separated from her body, hidden, secured with this key. A key she insisted be buried with her. You look again at the rust, the design, the tiny flick of an R near the shaft's base. Could that stand for Regina or Robert? The thought chills you, because if you know anything about Elizabeth, it's that she never truly let go of one man, Robert Dudley, her sweet Robin, her childhood companion, her trusted courtier, the man she danced with more than any other, the man she never married, but never dismissed, either. His name was always there, hovering in the background, long after his wife's mysterious death, long after scandal made their union politically impossible. And now, here's a key, possibly inscribed with an R. What if the box, that box, contained her final truth? A letter? A token? A confession? Something so intimate that it had to be removed from the physical remains, but not discarded, kept nearby, hidden, and maybe someone did hide it. Maybe when her body was prepared, a trusted hand took the key, slipped it under the coffin, sealed it in dust and time, and left no note. Because they didn't need to. They trusted that someday, someone would find it. And you just did. The implications unspool quickly. There's a hidden box somewhere, not in this tomb, but possibly within the abbey. A relic, disguised, archived, mislabeled. Maybe it's sitting in a locked cabinet, marked 16th century misc, gathering dust, overlooked by curators too focused on the gold leaf and illuminated manuscripts to recognize the power of a plain wooden chest. And maybe, just maybe, this key still works. Because iron doesn't forget, and neither does love. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly loved Robert, whether she used him, whether she mourned him, whether their bond was romantic or purely political. whether she wore black for months after his death out of custom or devastation. But this key, it says she kept a part of him. And if the box still exists, if it's opened, what might it say? A letter written in her hand, unguarded, unfiltered. A portrait never made public. A lock of his hair, pressed between pages. A poem. Something mundane. Or something that rewrites the way we understand England's greatest queen. You rise, brushing your fingers against the key again, tucking it carefully into your pocket. But the pressure of it feels larger than its size. Like it's connected to more than one lock. Not just a box, but a truth. And maybe that's what Elizabeth feared the most. Not death, not decay, but silence. To be buried under stone and lie still forever while the world debated her soul with no actual proof of it. And so, she scattered fragments, left trails, clues. This key is one. A rusted whisper that says, I loved, I hid, I remembered, and now, so will you. Because once you've held this kind of secret, you don't walk away from it. You trace it forward, through archives, through shadows, through rooms filled with cabinets no one has opened in decades. The box is somewhere, waiting, and the queen. She left the door unlocked, just barely for you to find. You exit the vault with the key still warm in your pocket. It's strange how something so small can feel like it carries centuries, like weight and time are the same thing. And with every step you take back up through the tight stone corridors of Westminster, you feel the shift, the change, as if you've crossed through something more than architecture, not just a tomb, a threshold. The moment you reach the archive level, the air changes again, drier here, lined with climate control, motion sensors, and a faint hum of preservation. The past, boxed and labeled, sits behind locked glass and digital entries. Shelves rise high, like cathedral ribs, filled not with relics, but asterisk fragments, catalogued, tagged, almost but not quite forgotten. You show the key to a curator. He raises an eyebrow, tells you there's nothing it could possibly match here. You insist. He lets you dig, and that's when you find it. Back wall, behind a false drawer, marked Donations, Misc. C. 1620. A chest, rough cedar, with brass brackets and a latch long since rusted shut. 3 dots in a ring. You place the key in, and it turns. Of course it does. Inside, a pile of velvet that smells like iron and ash. And under that, letters, dozens, tied with ribbon, stiff with time. Some inked in black, others in faded brown. Sealed with wax, most of it cracked, some intact, each marked with initials, ER and RD. You sit back hard. You'd expected one letter, a confession, a love note, maybe a lock of hair. Not this, a correspondence, hidden, erased. A decade's worth of secret words exchanged between the Queen of England and the man she could never marry. There's no time to read them all now, but you open one gently and read. It's dated July 1572. Elizabeth writes, asterisk. You ask if I remember the orchard where we once spoke plainly. I do. I remember more than you know. I remember the silence that followed your question, and my cowardice in answering it. I remember the taste of cherries and dust, and the way the sun caught the edge of your sleeve like it meant something. Asterisk, you stop, because this isn't the Queen. This is just a woman, young, lonely, brilliant, and burdened and terrified of wanting too much, of saying the thing that could end her reign or her life. And Robert? His reply is there too. Asterisk, I would not ask again. Only, if I had died yesterday, I would have done so still wishing you had answered yes. Asterisk, the letters go on like that. Coded, careful, raw, sometimes playful, sometimes desperate, sometimes cold. And in one, dated the week after his wife, Amy's suspicious death, Elizabeth writes only one line, asterisk, if you had been mine, none of this would have happened. No signature. just the wax seal. These aren't political. They aren't propaganda. They're a relationship unfolding on paper. Two people navigating power and passion and pressure, knowing that what they have can never be crowned. But here, in the cedar dark, they reign together. Letters like these shouldn't exist. They break the story. They complicate the myth. They remind you that the woman who signed death warrants and faced down kings was also someone who whispered through paper. Someone who trusted a man not with her country but with her asterisk words. And that's rarer. She told the world she married England, that she was above desire, above weakness. But these pages, they say she asterisk wanted, and that she chose not to have, not because she didn't feel, but because she asterisk felt too much. Asterisk, you understand now why the key was hidden, why the box vanished, why none of this ever made it into the official records. Because it makes her human, and history hates that. It prefers gods, icons, women with marble eyes and gilded lies. But Elizabeth wasn't built from stone. She was asterisk-ridden, and these letters are proof. You read one more before the lights flicker to signal closing. It's dated 2 years before Robert's death. Elizabeth writes, asterisk, if I should outlive you, I shall bury you in silence. But if you outlive me, I pray you speak nothing. Let them believe what they will. Let them say, I ruled with iron, not affection. But you and I will know the truth. Asterisk, you close the box. You relock the key. Because this isn't for the world. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some truths are meant to stay folded in velvet, resting in cedar, suspended in the soft quiet between myth and memory. You don't need to publish these. You already understand her better now than anyone ever has. Not because she confessed, but because she asterisk trusted. And that's more powerful than any crown. As you walk back through the halls of Westminster, past Elizabeth's monument and Mary's stone, past tourists murmuring about stained glass and saints, you feel it again, that hum, not ghost, not guilt, but gravity, because you know what lies beneath. You know what she carried and what she asterisk kept. You step out into the night, leaving Westminster behind. The city hums differently now. Not louder, quieter. Or maybe it's you who's changed. Your senses tuned to something else, something asterisk older. The street lamps flicker gold, and beneath their light, every passing figure seems like a shadow of someone once known, a Tudor ghost in modern clothes, a whisper from a queen who never wanted to be forgotten. And she won't be. Not now, because you've held her silence in your hands, and you've heard it speak. You walk toward the Thames, that ancient, sluggish artery that once carried plague and kings, merchants and mothers, executioners and queens. Elizabeth watched this river from her palace windows. She crossed it for coronations, saw its waters flicker with cannon fire when the Armada fell, and here you are, breathing its same wet breath. What do you do with what you've found? The world knows the public version, Elizabeth, draped in pearls and powdered myths, wielding speeches like swords. The Gloriana, the icon, the untouchable. But that's not the woman in the coffin. Not the one who kept a braid of her own hair. Not the one who pressed her voice into paper for a man she could never claim. You could tell the world, unseal the box, publish the letters, start a frenzy. Or you could do what she asked. Let the myth stand. Let her sleep. Historians still argue whether legacy is earned or curated, whether it's better to know the messy truth or respect the polished lie, whether peeling back the past is an act of reverence or robbery. You find yourself torn, because Elizabeth herself might not have wanted this story told. She burned letters, ordered loyal courtiers to destroy correspondence. She knew how the future worked. She knew that if people saw the cracks, the whole statue might fall. And yet she left the key. She left the slipper, the initials, the note. So maybe she did want to be known just Not by asterisk everyone. Just by someone who wouldn't turn her into a scandal headline or a paperback heroine with smudged eyeliner. In a doomed affair. Someone like you. You sit on a low bench by the river and imagine her here, wrapped in a cloak, face bare, unguarded, eating cherries out of a cloth, complaining about her stiff bodice, laughing, maybe, at the absurdity of it, all empire and portraiture, and being called the Virgin Queen when all she really wanted, sometimes, was just to be alone without being lonely. You wonder what she'd say to you. Probably something sharp. She had a tongue like a fencing foil, fast, elegant, and not afraid to draw blood. But maybe, after a pause, after studying your face in silence, she'd say something softer. Asterisk, you listened. Because that's what no one ever did. Not truly. They watched her, worshipped her, feared her, but they didn't asterisk listen. To the pauses, to the silences, to the choices she didn't make, like not marrying, not confessing, not crowning a successor, not forgiving, not repenting. Each absence was as loud as any declaration, and you somehow heard it, in the lead coffin's chill, in the velvet's whisper, in the box's click. You realize now that Elizabeth didn't want immortality through monuments. She wanted intimacy, connection, to be remembered not as an icon, but as a story, flawed, conflicted, fierce, human, and that's why she planted clues not for fame, but for asterisk witness, for someone to find the broken bits and not fix them, but hold them, because sometimes, being remembered for who you really were is the greatest gift of all. Not the armor, not the crown, but the breath between them. You stand up, the river glints, black and soft. The key is still in your pocket, but you don't need it now. You've already unlocked what matters. You walk back through London's sleeping streets, Elizabeth's presence trailing just behind you, not haunting, not watching, but asterisk accompanying. Her story now stitched into your own, her silence shared, her slipper steps beside yours. And as the abbey falls out of view behind the curve of night, you don't feel like you've left her. You feel like you've joined her, at last. By the time you return home, it's nearly morning. The sky is that soft, bruised purple just before it breaks open. Birds are stirring, windows are glowing amber, and somewhere out there, in a locked room behind a plaque that gets polished every Thursday, lies the body of a queen who still hasn't quite finished her reign. You set the key down on your desk, not in a display, just quietly, gently, and then you begin to write. Not an article, not a report, just notes, observations, fragments, like she did. You're not sure what you'll do with them yet. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But the urge to capture it all before the daylight waters it down is too strong. You write about the slipper, first the worn leather, the arch of the sole. You describe the scent of the coffin, sweet decay and velvet rot. You describe the way the braid felt frail, but determined, like a voice wrapped in silk. You pause, then add one line in the corner of the page. Asterisk, she was never just one thing. Asterisk, because that's what sticks with you most. Not the majesty, not the myths, but the asterisk multiplicity. She was a queen, a prisoner, a strategist, a daughter, a flirt, a tyrant, a poet, a woman afraid of death and hungry for legacy, and stubborn as rain in winter. She was all of it. And we, history's children, tried to make her one thing, one headline, one symbol, one archetype. But she was so much more than that. She was contradiction carved into skin. She was silence weaponized. She was politics in pearls and trauma in lace. And she dared to live without apology in a world that expected her to be grateful just for existing. You think about the fact that her mother was beheaded before Elizabeth turned 3, that she grew up in a world that whispered she shouldn't exist, that she wore that doubt like armor and remade herself out of fear and willpower. And you think about the box, those letters, that voice, so quiet, so personal, tucked into a cedar tomb away from kings and history books. And you know now, she didn't need to be immortal. She just didn't want to be misunderstood. And here you are, one person, centuries later, finally listening. You glance out the window. The city is fully awake now. Buses rumble. Coffee shops unlock. Life goes on. No one knows what you've just seen, what you've just carried, what you'll never be able to forget. And maybe that's what she wanted. Not a fanfare, not a statue, just a single mind touched by her shadow. A single whisper received. You breathe out, long and slow. Then you write one final sentence. Asterisk, she lived. She asterisk felt. She mattered. Asterisk, and the rest. You leave unwritten. Because some truths aren't meant to be spoken. They're meant to be asterisk held. Like a braid in a box. Like a key in your palm. Like the name Elizabeth, echoing softly between your ribs, long after the tomb is closed again. Like now. Sweet dreams.